There's something sacred about Christmas morning when you're a parent. Those quiet moments before the children wake up, when you stand in your doorway, watching them sleep, counting your blessings. You imagine their faces when they discover what Santa brought. You picture the joy, the laughter, the memory you're about to create together. But imagine waking up on Christmas morning to silence. No excited voices calling out, "Mama, Papa, come see." No little feet running down the hallway. Instead, you're standing barefoot in the December snow, still in your nightclothes, watching everything you've built disappear into towering flames. Your home, your life, your dreams, all gone. And your children? 5 of your precious children are simply gone. Not just missing, vanished, as if they never existed at all. This nightmare became reality for George and Jenny Sodder. Christmas morning, 1945, in the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia. What began as the most magical night of the year became a mystery so profound, so filled with dark secrets, that it would haunt not just one family, but an entire nation. For 37 years, anyone driving through the mountains of West Virginia would see something that broke their heart. A massive billboard, bearing the photographs of 5 beautiful children. Beneath their innocent faces, a parent's desperate plea. What was their fate? Kidnapped, murdered, or are they still alive? The answer? Nearly 80 years later, we still don't know. But the evidence tells a story that will chill you to your very soul. Because what happened to the Sodder family wasn't just a tragedy, it was something far more sinister. It was a crime so carefully planned, so ruthlessly executed, that it required the help of people these parents trusted most. This is more than a missing persons case. This is a story about the unbreakable bonds of family, the corruption of justice, and the power of a parent's love to transcend time itself. It's a story that asks the most fundamental question any of us can face. How far would you go to find your children? In 1945, the American dream was more than just a phrase. It was a promise. A promise that if you worked hard, if you sacrificed, if you believed in something greater than yourself, you could build a life of meaning and prosperity. For George and Jenny Sodder, that promise had become beautiful reality. George's story began like so many others of that generation, with courage and an unshakable faith in tomorrow. In 1908, 13-year-old Giorgio Sodder stood on the deck of a ship, approaching Ellis Island, clutching a worn suitcase, speaking not a word of English. His older brother, overwhelmed by the enormity of their journey, took one look at the New York skyline and booked passage back to Sardinia that very day. But George stayed. Even as a boy, he possessed something that would define him for the rest of his life. An absolute refusal to give up when things got difficult. Think about that for a moment. Here was a child, 13 years old, choosing to stay in a foreign country where he knew no one, spoke no English, had no family. What kind of inner strength does that require? What kind of vision of the future? George found work carrying water to railroad crews in Pennsylvania, back-breaking labor for a boy. But he understood something that perhaps we've forgotten in our modern world, that honest work, no matter how humble, has its own dignity. Every callus on his hands was an investment in his future. Every dollar saved was a step closer to his dream. After several years, he made his way to West Virginia, where the coal industry was booming. An opportunity beckoned to those brave enough to seize it. It was there, in the small town of Smithers, that he met Jenny Cipriani, a beautiful young woman whose family had brought her to America when she was just 3 years old. Their courtship was the stuff of old-world romance. George, now calling himself by his American name, was building his own trucking company. Jenny was the daughter of a respected storekeeper. Both understood the value of hard work, the importance of family, and the sacred responsibility that comes with the American dream. When they married in 1922 and settled in Fayetteville, they weren't just starting a family, they were creating a legacy. Their home became the heart of the local Italian-American community. George's trucking business prospered, hauling coal from the mines that powered America's growth. By 1945, they owned a beautiful 2-story timber frame house, on a hillside overlooking the town. But their true wealth wasn't measured in property or business success. Their true wealth was gathered around their dinner table every evening. 10 children, ranging in age from 3 to 23. Let me paint you a picture of what family meant in 1945. This was before television consumed our evenings, before the internet scattered our attention, before the pace of modern life pulled families in 100 different directions. The Sodder children grew up in a world where family dinner was sacred, where children played together instead of staring at screens, where parents were partners in the great work of raising the next generation. John, at 23, worked alongside his father, learning the business that would someday be his. Marion, 17, worked at the local dime store, but spent her wages on gifts for her younger siblings. George Jr., 16, was already showing the same entrepreneurial spirit that had driven his father across an ocean. And the younger children? Maurice, at 14, was old enough to handle real responsibilities, feeding livestock, tending to chores that kept the family running. Martha, at 12, Jenny, at 8, and little Betty, at 5, were still young enough to believe in magic. Still young enough to lie awake on Christmas Eve, straining to hear reindeer on the roof. George held strong opinions about many things, about business, about politics, about the war that had just ended in Europe. He particularly despised Mussolini and what fascism had done to his homeland. But here's what made George Sodder truly remarkable. Despite all his success, despite all his strong convictions, his world revolved completely around his children. Every decision he made, every risk he took, every long day of work, it was all for them. He had experienced what it meant to be alone in the world, and he was determined that his children would never know that loneliness. So when I tell you what happened next, remember this. George Sodder was a man who would have gladly died before allowing harm to come to his children. Jenny was a mother whose love knew no bounds, whose protective instincts were as fierce as any mother who has ever lived. What happened to them challenges everything we believe about justice, about protection, about the fundamental safety of our own homes. It forces us to confront a terrible truth, that sometimes evil comes not from strangers in the night, but from the very people we trust most. There's an old Italian saying, "The wolf changes his coat, but not his nature." George Sodder's grandfather might have whispered those words to him as a child, never imagining how prophetic they would become. You see, if this were simply a tragic house fire, a family destroyed by fate and circumstance, that would be heartbreaking enough. But what transforms the Sodder case from tragedy to horror is what happened in the months leading up to Christmas Eve. A series of warnings so specific, so deliberately threatening, that they can only be understood as promises of what was to come. Picture this. It's October, 1945. America is celebrating the end of World War II. Victory gardens are being planted with flowers instead of vegetables. Young men are coming home to marry their sweethearts and start families. The future has never looked brighter. But for George Sodder, the peace would be shattered by a visitor who would change everything. Imagine George answering his front door to find a well-dressed stranger, a life insurance salesman, or so he claimed. In those days, door-to-door salesmen were as common as mail delivery. A family man like George would have listened politely, perhaps offered the man a cup of coffee, treated him with the hospitality that good people extend to strangers. But when George politely declined the man's insurance offer, something changed. The stranger's professional demeanor vanished. His eyes hardened. His voice dropped to a whisper that carried more menace than any shout. "Your house is going to go up in smoke," the man said slowly, deliberately. "And your children are going to be destroyed. You're going to pay for the dirty remarks you've been making about Mussolini." Let that settle in your heart for a moment. This wasn't road rage or a baroom argument. This was a calculated threat, delivered by someone who knew intimate details about George's life, his political opinions, his family situation, his deepest vulnerabilities. Think about how you would feel hearing those words. Think about the chill that would run down your spine, the way your mind would race, trying to understand who this person was and why he knew so much about you. But the threats didn't end there. A few weeks later, another stranger appeared at the Sodder home. This one claimed to be looking for work, something George, with his generous heart, would never turn away. Having built his own success from nothing, he understood the dignity of honest labor and was always willing to help someone find employment. But this man wasn't interested in work. He wandered to the back of the house, studied George's electrical setup with the expertise of a professional, and made an observation that must have sent ice through George's veins. "These fuse boxes are going to cause a fire someday," the stranger said. Pointing at the electrical panel, George was bewildered. He'd just had the entire house rewired when they installed their new electric stove. The local power company had inspected everything and pronounced it in perfect condition. Why would a man seeking employment be commenting on his electrical system? And why did his words echo the earlier threat about fire? You know, when we look back on our lives, we can often see the moments when everything changed. Those crossroads where one path led to happiness and another to heartbreak. For George Sodder, these visitors were more than strange encounters. They were warnings. Perhaps they were even his last chance to understand the danger that was coming for his family. But how could he have known? How could any of us know? When evil is wearing the mask of ordinary life. What George didn't realize, what he couldn't have realized, was that these weren't random threats from disturbed individuals. They were part of something larger, something more sinister than he could have imagined. That insurance salesman who promised his house would burn and his children would be destroyed, he would later surface as a member of the coroner's jury that would rule the fire accidental. The same man who threatened the family would be in a position to control the official story about what happened to them. Think about the implications of that. Think about what it means when the people threatening you are the same people who will investigate your tragedy. Think about how powerless that would make you feel, how impossible it would make any search for justice. But even more disturbing is what this tells us about the nature of the threat George was facing. This wasn't the work of a lone madman. This was organized. This was planned. This was a conspiracy that reached into the very institutions meant to protect his family. There's a lesson here that perhaps our generation understands better than others. That evil rarely announces itself with horns and pitchforks. More often, it comes dressed as respectability, hiding behind badges and official titles, using our trust in institutions as a weapon against us. The warnings George received in the autumn of 1945 were more than threats. They were a countdown. And as Christmas Eve approached, that countdown was running out. Christmas Eve, 1945, dawned crisp and clear in the hills of West Virginia. If you close your eyes, you can almost picture it, the kind of perfect winter day that makes you believe in magic again. Snow dusting the pine trees like powdered sugar, the promise of celebration hanging in the air like wood smoke from a dozen chimneys. For the Sodder family, this Christmas Eve began like countless others before it, with the beautiful, chaotic symphony that only a large family can create. You have to understand what Christmas meant to a family like the Sodders in 1945. This wasn't the commercial spectacle we know today, driven by credit cards and shopping mall frenzy. This was Christmas as it was meant to be, a celebration of family, of faith, of the simple miracle of being together. George and the older boys, John and George Jr., had spent the day working at the trucking company. December was always busy, with extra shipments needed before the holiday shutdown. It was honest, physical work that left them tired but satisfied, looking forward to the simple pleasure of a warm meal and a quiet evening with family. But oh, the excitement of the younger children. If you've ever been around children on Christmas Eve, you know that particular energy, that electric anticipation that makes them bounce on their toes and speak in whispers about Santa Claus and presents and magic. Marion, the 17-year-old daughter, had spent her day at the dime store in downtown Fayetteville. But instead of thinking about herself, Instead of spending her hard-earned wages on something for her own pleasure, she'd done what young people did in those days. She'd thought of her family first. With the careful planning that only a teenage sister can possess, she'd purchased Christmas gifts for her younger siblings, toys that she'd hidden away for weeks, imagining the joy on their faces when they discovered them Christmas morning. When she arrived home that evening and surprised Martha, 12, little Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5, with their unexpected gifts, the children's excitement became impossible to contain. "Mama, can we play with them now? Can we stay up a little longer? Please?" Now, any parent knows this moment. The children are buzzing with excitement. Bedtime is approaching, and you're torn between maintaining routine and creating magical memories. Jenny Sodder, the mother, not to be confused with her 8-year-old daughter, looked at those glowing faces and felt her heart melt. It was Christmas Eve, after all. What harm could there be in letting them enjoy this moment a little longer? "All right," she said with the gentle authority that mothers have perfected through generations. "But Maurice and Louis, you boys remember to bring in the cows and feed the chickens before you come to bed." At 14, Maurice was old enough to handle real responsibility. 9-year-old Louis looked up to his older brother and would follow his lead. They were good boys, raised with the kind of work ethic and family loyalty that built strong character. By 10 o'clock, the house had settled into that perfect Christmas Eve rhythm. George and the older boys, exhausted from their day of work, had already gone to bed, trusting that tomorrow would bring the joy and rest that Christmas promised. Jenny took 3-year-old Sylvia upstairs with her, leaving Marion to supervise the younger children. The house was filled with the gentle sounds of contentment, children playing quietly with their new toys, the soft crackle of the fire in the fireplace, perhaps the distant sound of Christmas carols on the radio. It was, by every measure, a perfect Christmas Eve, a family safe in their own home, surrounded by love, looking forward to the simple pleasures of Christmas morning. Prosody rate %. The kind of evening that becomes a treasured memory, the kind that children carry with them for the rest of their lives. But at 12:30 in the morning, that peace was shattered by the shrill ring of the telephone. In 1945, a phone call after midnight was rare and usually meant trouble. When that jarring sound cut through the quiet of Christmas morning, Jenny's maternal instincts immediately went on alert. She made her way downstairs, past Marion, who had fallen asleep on the couch, past the children's new toys scattered around the living room, to answer the phone. "Hello?" On the other end was a woman's voice, unfamiliar, asking for someone whose name Jenny didn't recognize. In the background, she could hear the sound of clinking glasses and distant laughter, as if the caller were at some kind of party. "I'm sorry, you have the wrong number," Jenny said politely. And then she heard it. A laugh. Not the embarrassed chuckle of someone who dialed incorrectly, but something else. Something that made every maternal instinct in her body scream danger. The woman hung up without another word. As Jenny stood there in the darkness, the phone still in her hand, she felt something she couldn't quite name. A mother's intuition, perhaps. That sixth sense that tells you when something isn't right, even when you can't explain why. She noticed things as she made her way back upstairs, things that would later seem significant. The front door was unlocked. All the downstairs lights were still on. The curtains were open. The children had forgotten to secure the house for the night, forgotten the chores they'd promised to complete. Jenny locked the door, turned off the lights, closed the curtains, and went back to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Something about that phone call, about that laugh, lingered in her mind like a discordant note in a beautiful song. At 1:00 a.m., she was jolted awake by a loud thud on the roof, followed by what sounded like something rolling across the shingles and falling to the ground. Again, that prickle of unease. But it was Christmas Eve. It was late, and she was tired. She convinced herself it was probably just an icicle falling from the roof. These old houses made all kinds of sounds in winter. She was wrong. At 1:30 a.m., Jenny Sodder woke up for the third time. But this time, it wasn't a sound that woke her. It was the smell of smoke. And in that moment, the perfect Christmas Eve became a nightmare that would haunt America for the next 80 years. The next few minutes would haunt Jenny Sodder for the rest of her life. She smelled smoke and knew immediately that this wasn't a chimney backdraft or a forgotten candle. This was something much worse. Jumping out of bed, she rushed to George's office, the room where the smell seemed strongest, and threw open the door. What she saw defied comprehension. The entire office was engulfed in flames that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. This wasn't a small fire that might have been manageable. This was an inferno, hungry and spreading fast, consuming everything in its path. "George, George, wake up! Fire!" Within minutes, precious minutes that felt like hours, the entire first floor was ablaze. George and Jenny grabbed 3-year-old Sylvia and rushed outside into the bitter December cold. John, Marion, and George Jr. managed to escape on their own, their nightclothes offering little protection against the frigid mountain air. But as they stood in the snow, watching their home being devoured by flames that seemed to dance with malicious joy, they realized with growing horror that 5 children were still inside. Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, little Jenny, 8, Betty, 5, all of them sleeping in the upstairs bedrooms, now cut off by a wall of fire that made rescue seem impossible. You know, we tell ourselves that in moments of crisis, we would be heroes. We imagine ourselves rising to the occasion, finding strength we didn't know we possessed. But the truth is that some situations are designed to defeat us, orchestrated to ensure that even the strongest, most determined person will fail. What happened next reveals just how far someone had gone to ensure that those 5 children would never make it out alive. George's first instinct was pure father, to climb the outside wall of the house and reach the upstairs windows where his children were trapped. He managed to break one window, cutting his arm badly on the glass. But the smoke and flames were too intense. He couldn't see anything, couldn't reach his babies who were just feet away, but might as well have been on the moon. "The ladder," he shouted to his sons. "Get the ladder." The ladder that was always propped against the side of the house. The ladder George used regularly for maintenance. The ladder that had been there just that afternoon when he'd checked it before the holiday. It was gone. Not fallen down in the wind. Not knocked over by accident. Gone. Desperate. His heart pounding with the kind of terror that only a parent can know. George ran to his trucks. He'd drive one right up to the house and climb on top to reach the windows. It was dangerous, maybe impossible, but he had to try. His children were up there, and every second counted. He turned the key in his first truck, a truck that had run perfectly for years. That had never given him a moment's trouble. Nothing. Dead. He ran to the second truck, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the key. Same result. Dead. 2 trucks that had worked flawlessly just hours before, both mysteriously inoperable at the exact moment he needed them most. The mathematical probability of such a coincidence was virtually 0. But George didn't have time to think about probabilities. His children were dying, and time was running out. "Water!" he shouted. "We need water!" He ran to the rain barrel he kept for emergencies, the barrel that might at least slow the fire enough to buy them time. It was frozen solid. Not unusual for December in West Virginia, but devastating in that moment when every second meant the difference between life and death. Meanwhile, Marion was running through the snow to the neighbors, pounding on doors, trying to get someone to call the fire department. But here's where this story takes a turn that should make your blood run cold. The first neighbor she reached tried to call, but couldn't get through to the operator. The phone system was down. The second neighbor had the same problem, no operator response. Finally, one neighbor gave up trying to call, and instead drove into town to personally alert the fire chief. Now, you might be thinking, these things happen. Equipment fails, especially during emergencies. But consider this. The Fayetteville fire station was only 2.5 miles from the Sodder home. 2.5 miles. In a small town like Fayetteville, where everyone knew everyone, where the fire department was volunteer but dedicated, they should have been there in 15 minutes. 20 at the most. They arrived 7 hours later. 7 hours. By the time the firefighters reached the Sodder property, there was nothing left but a smoldering foundation and a family standing in their nightclothes in the snow, staring at the ruins of their life. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was yet to come. Fire Chief F.J. Morris began his investigation by sifting through the ashes where 5 children should have been found. In any normal house fire, even the most intense blaze, there would be remains. Human bones don't simply vanish. Teeth are incredibly durable. There should have been something. Some trace, some evidence that 5 young lives had ended in that basement. Instead, Morris found nothing. Absolutely nothing. Sometimes, the absence of something is more telling than its presence. The absence of any trace of 5 children who should have been in that house tells a story that the official investigators didn't want to hear. But the evidence was screaming a truth that would take the Sodder family years to fully understand. This was no accident. This was a carefully planned crime, executed with precision and covered up by people in positions of trust and authority. The question wasn't whether the Sodder children had died in that fire. The question was, where were they, and who had taken them? In the gentle light of a winter dawn, Fire Chief F.J. Morris stood among the smoldering ruins of what had been the Sodder family home just hours before. He was tasked with a grim duty, finding the remains of 5 children who everyone believed had perished in the flames. Morris was an experienced man, someone who had seen his share of tragedy in a coal mining town where danger was never far away. He knew what to expect from a house fire. He knew what intense heat could and couldn't do to human remains. What he found defied everything he thought he understood about fire and death. Nothing. In a basement where 5 children should have left some trace of their existence, bones, teeth, anything, Morris found absolutely nothing. The fire must have burned so hot it cremated the bodies completely, he told the Sodders. Though anyone who heard the uncertainty in his voice might have wondered if he truly believed his own words. But George Sodder wasn't buying it. He'd been in the trucking business for decades, had seen industrial fires that burned far hotter than any house fire could. He'd never heard of temperatures that could completely erase human remains, leaving not even a fragment of bone or tooth behind. You know, there's something to be said for the wisdom that comes from a lifetime of honest work. George Sodder might not have had formal education, but he had the kind of practical knowledge that comes from paying attention to the world around you. He knew the difference between what was possible and what was probable, and what he was being told was simply not possible. Still, what choice did he have? His children were gone, his house was gone, and Christmas morning had become the worst day of his life. The fire was ruled accidental, caused by faulty wiring. Death certificates were issued for the 5 missing children before the new year, listing the cause of death as fire or suffocation. Case closed, according to the authorities. But for George and Jenny, the case was just beginning. Within days of the fire, details began emerging that made the official story impossible to believe. Each revelation was like a piece of a puzzle that, when assembled, painted a picture of something far more sinister than a tragic accident. First, they learned that their phone line hadn't simply gone down during the fire. It had been deliberately cut, not damaged by heat or falling debris, but severed cleanly with a tool. Someone had intentionally isolated the family, ensuring they couldn't call for help. Second, that missing ladder was found the next day, thrown into a ditch a considerable distance from the house. Someone had moved it there deliberately, making sure George couldn't reach his children. Third, witnesses began coming forward with stories that should have made headlines, but somehow never did. A woman who lived nearby reported seeing a car parked near the Sodder house on Christmas Eve, with several people inside who seemed to be watching the property. Later, that same night, after the fire started, she saw what appeared to be 5 children being led to a car and driven away. A bus driver making his late-night Christmas Eve route reported seeing people throwing balls of fire at the Sodder house. Evidence that the blaze had been deliberately set. And perhaps most compelling of all, a motel owner in Charleston came forward to say that 4 children matching the description of the missing Sodders, accompanied by 2 men and 2 women of Italian extraction, had stayed at her establishment just days after the fire. These weren't random sightings by unreliable witnesses. These were credible people providing specific, detailed information. And yet, somehow, none of this evidence seemed to matter to the official investigation. When George pressed for a more thorough investigation, he was told that the state fire marshal's office would handle it. But after 4 days of looking at the smoking ruins, 4 days of being reminded every moment of what he had lost, George couldn't stand it anymore. He had the site bulldozed and covered with 5 feet of dirt, intending to plant a memorial garden for his lost children. It was an act of a broken man, trying to find some way to heal. But it may also have been the destruction of evidence that could have solved the case. 4 years later, in 1949, George made a decision that would change everything. Haunted by questions that wouldn't leave him alone, he decided to excavate the site to see if there was anything the investigators had missed. What he found should have provided answers. Instead, it raised even more disturbing questions. Human vertebrae, actual bone fragments that had somehow survived whatever had happened in that basement. Finally, George thought, proof that human beings had died in the fire. He carefully collected the bones and sent them to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis. Surely now he would have the confirmation he needed to put his doubts to rest. The results were shocking. The bones belonged to someone between 16 and 17 years old at the time of death. That could have been Maurice, who was 14. Bone age determination isn't precise, and stress and poor nutrition could affect development. But here's what should have ended the case right there. The bones showed no signs of fire damage whatsoever. None. They looked like they had never been exposed to intense heat. Think about what this means. Someone found human bones in the basement of a house that had burned to the ground. Bones that showed no evidence of ever being in a fire. The Smithsonian's expert offered a chilling possibility. The bones had been planted there, possibly taken from a nearby cemetery and buried in the dirt that George had used to cover the foundation. Someone had literally tried to fake evidence of the children's deaths. There's a lesson here about the nature of truth and justice. Sometimes the evidence we're meant to find is more revealing than the evidence we're supposed to miss. Those planted bones weren't proof that the children had died. They were proof that someone wanted the family to stop looking for them. But who would go to such elaborate lengths to cover up what had really happened, and why? The answers to those questions would lead the Sodder family into a labyrinth of corruption and conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of West Virginia's government, revealing a truth about American justice that most of us would prefer not to know. By 1950, George and Jenny Sodder had spent 5 long years seeking answers that seemed to slip further away with each passing day. They had been told by local authorities that their children were dead and the matter was closed. State authorities insisted there was no evidence of foul play. Federal authorities claimed it wasn't their jurisdiction. But the Sodders had something that bureaucrats and corrupt officials couldn't account for: the unbreakable determination of parents who refused to abandon their children. They hired private investigator C.C. Tinsley, a man with a reputation for finding truth in the darkest corners. What Tinsley uncovered was so shocking, so brazen in its corruption, that it eventually caught the attention of the West Virginia legislature itself. Remember that life insurance salesman who had threatened George back in October? The one who said the house would go up in smoke and the children would be destroyed? Tinsley discovered that this man wasn't just some disturbed individual making random threats. He was a member of the coroner's jury that ruled the fire accidental. Let that sink in for a moment. The man who threatened the family was in a position to control the official story about what happened to them. But it gets worse. Much worse. Tinsley also discovered that this same man was listed as a co-signer on the Sodders' home insurance policy. Without George's knowledge or consent, he had increased the family's coverage from $1,500 to $1,750 just before the fire. Think about the audacity of that. This man threatened a family, then positioned himself to profit from their tragedy and control the investigation into their loss. It's the kind of corruption that makes you question everything you believe about justice and the institutions meant to protect us. But Tinsley's investigation uncovered something even more disturbing. Something that revealed the depths of depravity some people will sink to when covering their tracks. Remember Fire Chief Morris? Who told the Sodders that no human remains had been found in the house? Tinsley learned that Morris had confided to a local minister that he had actually found something in the ashes, a human heart, that he'd packed into a metal box and secretly buried. When Tinsley and George confronted Morris about this revelation, the fire chief admitted it was true. He agreed to show them where he'd buried the box, and together they dug it up from the cold West Virginia earth. Inside the metal container, they found what Morris claimed was the heart of one of the Sodder children, physical proof that at least one of them had died in the fire. They took it to a local funeral director for examination. It was fresh beef liver. It had never been exposed to fire. Morris later claimed he'd buried the beef liver to give the family something to bury, to help them find closure. But think about what this really means. The fire chief had lied about finding human remains, then gone to elaborate lengths to fake evidence. Why would someone in his position do such a thing, unless he was trying to prevent the Sodders from continuing their investigation? By now, the case had attracted national attention. The West Virginia legislature held 2 separate hearings to investigate the matter. Newspapers across the country picked up the story. The FBI was asked to get involved. And then, something remarkable happened. Remarkable for all the wrong reasons. Governor Oki L. Pattison and State Police Superintendent W.E. Burchett held a press conference. In front of reporters from across the nation, they told the Sodders and the world that their search was hopeless and declared the case officially closed at the state level. The FBI, citing lack of cooperation from local authorities, dropped their investigation after 2 years of following leads that mysteriously went nowhere. Just like that, it was over. 5 children had vanished without a trace. Evidence of a cover-up was mounting, and the official response was to close the case and tell the grieving parents to move on. But George and Jenny Sodder had one more weapon in their arsenal, one that would ensure their children's story would never be forgotten. In 1952, they erected a massive billboard along U.S. Route 16, featuring photographs of their 5 missing children and offering a $5,000 reward for information leading to their recovery. Later, they would increase that reward to $10,000. That billboard became more than a plea for help. It became a symbol of resistance against corruption, a reminder that some people refuse to be silenced by those in power. For 37 years, that billboard stood as a testament to a parent's love. Travelers from across the country would stop to read about the missing Sodder children and wonder what had really happened on that Christmas Eve. You know, there's something profoundly American about that billboard. It represents the belief that when institutions fail us, when those in power abandon justice, ordinary people can still make their voices heard. It's the same spirit that brought a 13-year-old boy from Sardinia to Ellis Island, with nothing but hope and determination. And the billboard did something that all the official investigations had failed to do. It generated leads. Over the years, tips poured in from across the United States. Someone claimed to have seen Martha in a convent in St. Louis. Someone else reported overhearing a suspicious conversation about a Christmas Eve fire in West Virginia, in a bar in Texas. A person in Florida claimed the children were living with a distant relative of Jenny's. George Sodder followed up on every single lead, traveling thousands of miles and spending his life savings in his desperate search for his children. Most of the tips led nowhere, false hopes that broke his heart again and again. But one lead, one photograph that arrived in the mail 23 years after the fire, would give the family hope that lasted for decades. Time has a way of dulling even the sharpest pain. But a parent's love for their children transcends time itself. It endures through sleepless nights and empty birthdays, through Christmas mornings that never feel complete, through the gradual acceptance that some questions may never have answers. For 23 years, George and Jenny Sodder had lived with that particular agony known only to parents of missing children. The torture of not knowing. Were their babies alive somewhere, wondering why Mama and Papa never came to find them? Or had they found peace in whatever comes after this life? Then, in 1968, hope arrived in their mailbox in the form of a simple envelope that would change everything. Jenny went to collect the mail on what seemed like an ordinary day and found an envelope addressed only to her. No return address. Postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. A place she'd never been, where she knew no one. Inside was a single photograph. The image showed a young man in his mid-20s with dark, curly hair and intelligent brown eyes. He had a straight, strong nose and a distinctive upward tilt of his left eyebrow that any mother would recognize in an instant. Jenny's hands trembled as she stared at the photograph because she was looking at the face of her son Louis, the boy who had been 9 years old when he disappeared, now grown into a man. Can you imagine that moment? The shock, the joy, the flood of questions that must have overwhelmed her? For 23 years, she had wondered what her little boy would look like as a grown man. Now she was holding the answer in her hands. She called George immediately, and when he saw the photograph, he felt the same shock of recognition. This wasn't just someone who resembled Louis. This was Louis. The bone structure was identical, the eyes unmistakable. Even the way he held his head was the same. But on the back of the photograph, someone had written a cryptic message that was as puzzling as it was hopeful. Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, ill boys, a 90132 or 35. Louis Sodder. That part was clear enough. But who was brother Frankie? None of the Sodder children were named Frank or Frankie. Or were they? As George and Jenny studied the message more carefully, pieces of a puzzle began falling into place. Jenny's maiden name was Cipriani, and she did have a brother named Frank. At one point during their investigation, the Sodders had even suspected that Frank Cipriani might have been involved in the kidnapping, possibly taking the children to Florida, where several witnesses claimed to have seen them. Could Louis be trying to tell them something about his uncle Frank? Was this his way of saying he was with Frank Cipriani, that he was safe but couldn't come home? And what about those mysterious numbers, a 90132 or 35? The Sodders researched frantically and discovered that 90132 was the postal code for Palermo, Sicily in 1968. Were the children in Italy? Had they been taken back to the old country, raised by families there who might not even know their true identities? The questions multiplied like ripples in a pond, each answer leading to 10 more mysteries. But one thing seemed certain. If this really was Louis, then at least one of their children was alive. George and Jenny immediately hired another private investigator and sent him to Kentucky to trace the photograph's origin. They gave him every resource they could afford, every clue they had discovered. They never heard from him again. Just like the previous investigator who had disappeared while looking into the case, this man simply vanished. No reports, no phone calls, no explanation. It was as if he had walked into a void and been swallowed whole. Think about what that means. Two private investigators, working independently, both disappearing while investigating the same case. The odds of that being coincidence are virtually zero. Someone, or some organization, had the power and resources to make trained investigators disappear without a trace. But who had that kind of reach? Who had the ability to silence people across state lines, to make evidence disappear, to corrupt entire investigation processes? The photograph of Louis gave the Sodder family hope, but it also filled them with a new kind of anguish. If their children were alive, why couldn't they come home? What was keeping them away? Were they being held against their will, or were they protecting their family by staying hidden? Perhaps most heartbreaking of all, if Louis was alive and free enough to send a photograph, why couldn't he simply call? Why communicate through such cryptic means? The answer might be the most chilling possibility of all, that even as adults, even decades later, the Sodder children were still afraid, still protecting their family from forces that remained dangerous, even after all those years. George and Jenny updated their billboard to include the mysterious photograph, hoping it might generate new leads. They increased their reward to $10,000, a substantial sum that represented most of their remaining savings. But as the years passed and no new information surfaced, even the most optimistic members of the family began to wonder if they would ever learn the whole truth. George died in 1969, having spent the last 24 years of his life searching for his children. His final words to his family were a plea: never stop looking, never stop hoping, never let their story be forgotten. Jenny lived until 1989, tending the memorial garden she'd planted on the site of their former home, and keeping her children's photographs on her mantle until the day she died. The billboard remained standing until shortly after Jenny's death, when the surviving children finally took it down. By then, if the missing Sodder children were still alive, they would have been in their 50s and 60s. But their story was far from over. In fact, modern technology and new investigative techniques have opened up possibilities that George and Jenny never could have imagined. This is perhaps the most widely accepted explanation among those who believe the children were kidnapped. According to this theory, George Sodder's outspoken criticism of Mussolini had angered powerful figures in the Italian-American community, specifically members of the Sicilian mafia who supported the fascist regime. The theory suggests that the mafia tried to recruit George for their operations, or attempted to extort money from him. When he refused, they decided to teach him a lesson he'd never forget. The plan was elegant in its cruelty: kidnap the children under cover of a house fire, making it appear as though they died in the blaze. George would be punished for his defiance, but the children would be spared, raised by mafia families in Sicily, or hidden away in Italian communities across America. This theory explains many of the case's mysteries. The specific warnings George received, the precise timing of the fire, the disabled trucks and missing ladder, the corruption of local officials, and even the postal code reference in the 1968 photograph. It also explains why private investigators kept disappearing, and why authorities seemed so eager to close the case. If organized crime was behind the kidnapping, they would have had the resources and connections to silence anyone who got too close to the truth. A more disturbing possibility is that the Sodder children were victims of a human trafficking ring that operated in the region during the 1940s. This theory suggests that the children were taken to be sold to families who couldn't have children of their own, or worse, to be exploited for labor or other purposes. The 1940s were a lawless time in many parts of rural America. Corrupt officials could easily be bought or threatened into silence. A well-organized trafficking ring could have operated for years without detection, especially if they had inside help from local law enforcement. Think about what we know now about human trafficking, about how these networks operate, about the money involved. In 1945, 5 healthy, attractive children would have been worth a fortune to the right buyers, and the children's Italian heritage would have made them easy to place in Italian communities, where no one would ask questions about new family members. This theory is supported by the numerous credible sightings of the children in the days and weeks following the fire, always in the company of adults who seemed to be controlling their movements. Perhaps the most heartbreaking theory is that the kidnapping was orchestrated by people the Sodders knew and trusted, members of their own community who had reasons to want to hurt the family. George Sodder was a successful businessman with strong opinions and considerable wealth. Success often breeds resentment, especially in small communities where everyone knows everyone else's business. He may have made enemies without realizing it, people who saw his prosperity as an affront to their own struggles. The precision of the attack suggests intimate knowledge of the family's routines and security measures. The cut phone lines, the disabled vehicles, the removed ladder, the delayed fire response. All of this required inside information that only someone close to the family would possess. Under this theory, the children were taken by people they knew and trusted, which explains why they apparently left the house willingly. They may have been told there was a fire and that they were being taken to safety, never realizing until it was too late that they were being kidnapped. This theory explains the corruption of local officials and the deliberate bungling of the investigation. If prominent community members were involved, they would have had the influence to control the official response. The most heartbreaking theory of all is that the children survived the kidnapping and eventually learned the truth about what happened to them, but chose never to contact their family, out of fear for their parents' safety. If powerful criminal organizations were behind the kidnapping, any attempt by the children to return home might have resulted in tragedy for the entire family. The cryptic 1968 photograph might have been Lewis's way of letting his parents know he was alive, while still protecting them from further harm. This theory explains why the children never tried to come home, even as adults with families of their own. They were protecting the people they loved most, the parents who had never stopped searching for them. Imagine carrying that burden for a lifetime. Imagine knowing that your family was grieving for you, but also knowing that contacting them might put them in mortal danger. It's a sacrifice that speaks to the deepest kind of love, the willingness to break your own heart, to keep others safe. Which theory is correct? We may never know for certain. But there's one thing that all serious investigators agree on. This was not a tragic accident. This was a carefully planned crime that was covered up by people in positions of power and trust. The real question isn't whether the Sodder children were kidnapped. The question is, who took them? Who helped cover it up? And are any of them, or their descendants, still alive? In our modern age of DNA testing and global communication, that question might finally have an answer. But it will require courage from people who might know the truth, and it will require a justice system that's finally ready to confront the failures of the past. Sylvia Sodder Paxton was just 3 years old on the night her world changed forever. As the youngest survivor of the fire, she carried within her the last innocent memories of her family before tragedy struck. The sound of her siblings' laughter, the warmth of Christmas Eve, the feeling of being completely safe and loved. She spent the next 76 years of her life haunted by those memories, and driven by a promise she made to her parents, that she would never let her brothers and sisters be forgotten, until her death in 2021 at the age of 79. Sylvia never stopped believing that Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty had survived that Christmas Eve. She worked tirelessly to keep their story alive, cooperating with journalists, researchers, and filmmakers who wanted to tell the Sodder family's story. "I was the last one of the kids to leave home," she told a reporter in 2013, her voice carrying the weight of decades of grief and determination. "I experienced their grief for a long time." Think about what that means. To spend your entire life carrying your parents' grief. To wake up every day knowing that somewhere out there, your siblings might be living their own lives, unaware that their family never stopped searching for them. Sylvia often stayed up late with her father, talking about what might have happened to her brothers and sisters. She promised George and Jenny that she would do everything she could to find answers, that she would never let the world forget about 5 children who deserved better than they got. Her daughter, Jenny Henthorne, named after her grandmother, has continued that mission into the 21st century. The family has embraced modern technology, creating online forums and social media groups dedicated to solving the case. They've cooperated with podcasters, YouTubers, and amateur investigators who bring fresh eyes to decades-old evidence. But perhaps the most intriguing development in recent years has been the emergence of people claiming connections to the missing children. In 2019, someone commenting on a college student's blog about the case made a startling claim. The person wrote that their grandfather had shown them photos of the missing Sodder children and said he recognized them as people he'd known in the years following the fire. According to this account, the grandfather had been friends with several Italian families in the area and had even dated one of the women, whom he believed was Martha Sodder, living under a different name. He insisted there was no way they were just people who happened to look similar. He was certain they were the missing children. Could this be true? Is it possible that some of the Sodder children lived for decades in nearby communities under assumed names, recognized by neighbors who chose to keep their secret out of fear or loyalty? Other tantalizing clues have emerged from genealogical researchers who note that George Sodder's original name, Giorgio Soddu, and his mysterious past in Italy might hold keys to understanding what happened to his children. George never talked about his life in Sardinia or why he'd chosen to emigrate to America. Some researchers have suggested that he might have been fleeing something or someone in the old country, and that his past finally caught up with him in West Virginia. Modern DNA databases have revealed connections between Italian families that emigrated to America and relatives who remained in Sicily. If the Sodder children were taken back to Italy, as some theories suggest, their descendants might be living there today, completely unaware of their American heritage. The 1968 photograph remains one of the case's most compelling pieces of evidence. Modern photo analysis techniques that didn't exist when the picture was received could potentially reveal new details about where it was taken or when. The cryptic message on the back, Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, I lil boys, a 90132 or 35, has never been fully decoded. Each element might be a clue that could lead to the truth if only we knew how to read it. But perhaps the most profound aspect of the Sodder case isn't the mystery itself. It's what it tells us about the power of love to transcend time and circumstance. George and Jenny Sodder spent their lives searching for their children, not because they expected to find them, but because love demands action. It demands that we never give up, never stop hoping, never stop fighting for the people we hold dear. That billboard that stood for 37 years wasn't just a plea for information. It was a declaration of faith. Faith that love is stronger than evil, that truth will eventually overcome lies, that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. Every person who stopped to read about the missing Sodder children became part of their story. Every tip that came in, no matter how far-fetched, was investigated with the hope that it might be the key that unlocked the mystery. Today, the surviving members of the Sodder family continue to hope that advances in DNA technology, increased media attention, and the power of the internet will finally bring them the answers they've sought for nearly 8 decades. Every few years, a new lead emerges. Someone finds an old photograph in their grandmother's attic that might show one of the missing children. A genealogist discovers a connection between Italian families that emigrated to different parts of America. A researcher uncovers a previously unknown document related to the case. Each lead is investigated with the same desperate hope that has driven the Sodder family for generations, because somewhere out there the truth is waiting to be discovered. If you're watching this video, you're now part of that legacy. You know about Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty Sodder. You know that justice was denied to them and their family. And you know that in our modern world of instant communication and DNA testing, this mystery could be solved tomorrow if the right person comes forward with the right information. The Sodder children are still out there somewhere. Their story lives on in the hearts of everyone who refuses to let evil have the final word. As we reach the end of this story, I want you to sit quietly for a moment and think about something that should resonate in the depths of your soul. On Christmas Eve, 1945, 5 children went to bed in their own home, surrounded by family, excited about opening presents in the morning. By dawn, they had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions that have haunted America for nearly 80 years. Maurice would be 92 years old today. Martha would be 90. Louis would be 87. Jenny would be 85. Little Betty, who was only 5 when she disappeared, would be 83. If they're still alive, they're great-grandparents now, possibly great-great-grandparents. They might be living quiet lives in small towns across America or Italy, their true identities known only to themselves, and perhaps a few trusted family members who have carried the secret for generations. Or they might have taken their secrets to the grave decades ago, never knowing that their parents spent every remaining day of their lives searching for them, never knowing about the billboard that kept their faces before the world for nearly 4 decades. But this story forces us to confront truths about ourselves and our world that we'd rather not acknowledge. It shows us how easily justice can be corrupted when the right people are involved. It demonstrates how power and influence can silence inconvenient investigations and control official narratives. Most disturbing of all, it reveals how vulnerable we all are to forces we don't understand and can't control. The Sodder case isn't just about 5 missing children. It's about the nature of evil itself, how it hides behind badges and official titles, how it uses our trust in institutions as a weapon against us, how it preys on the innocent and then blames the victims for their own suffering. But it's also about something far more powerful than evil, the unbreakable bond between parents and children that transcends time, distance, and even death itself. George and Jenny Sodder never stopped looking for their children. They spent their life savings, traveled thousands of miles, and endured decades of heartbreak because they understood something that perhaps our modern world has forgotten: that love demands action, that hope requires courage, that some fights are worth fighting even when victory seems impossible. Their story reminds us that behind every unsolved case, behind every missing person report, behind every cold case file gathering dust in some police station, there are families who refuse to give up hope. There are mothers who still set extra places at the dinner table on birthdays. There are fathers who drive past playgrounds and wonder if that child on the swing might be their grandchild. There are siblings who spend their lives looking into crowds, searching for familiar faces that might belong to the brothers and sisters they lost so long ago. Today, the house where the Sodder children lived is gone, replaced by a memorial garden that Jenny tended until her death. The billboard that made them famous has been taken down. The investigators who worked their case have passed away. Even the youngest survivor of that terrible Christmas Eve, Sylvia Sodder Paxton, is no longer with us. But their story lives on, passed down through generations of family members who refused to let the world forget about 5 children who deserved better than they got. If you've watched this video all the way to the end, you're now part of that legacy. You know about Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty Sodder. You know that justice was denied to them and their family. And you know that somewhere out there, the truth is still waiting to be discovered. Maybe you're the person who will finally solve this mystery. Maybe you have a grandmother who used to tell stories about Italian families she knew in the 1940s. Maybe you have DNA results that could connect you to unknown relatives. Maybe you have access to records or photographs that could provide the missing piece of this puzzle. In our age of instant communication and global connectivity, in our time of DNA databases and genealogical research, this mystery could be solved tomorrow if the right person comes forward with the right information. The Sodder children are still out there, somewhere. Not just in the memories of those who loved them, but in the continuing search for truth that their story has inspired. They're out there in every parent who refuses to give up hope. They're out there in every investigator who takes on a cold case because justice matters more than convenience. They're out there in every person who chooses to speak truth in the face of powerful forces that would prefer silence. The question that haunts us all isn't just what happened to 5 children on Christmas Eve, 1945. The question is, what will we do with their story? Will we let it fade into history, or will we carry it forward as a reminder that love is stronger than evil, that truth will eventually overcome lies, that some fights are worth fighting even when victory seems impossible? The Sodder children are still missing, Justice is still waiting to be served. Truth is still fighting to be heard. Their story isn't over. It continues in the hearts of everyone who refuses to let evil have the final word. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Betty. Say their names. Remember their faces. Keep their story alive, because somewhere out there, they're still waiting to come home.